In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to use WeakMaps, which is a new type in ES6, to implement private properties and methods in an object. So continuing with our circle example, we want to turn this radius property into a private property. On the top, we're going to define a constant. We call it underline radius. That's just for our own convention to indicate that this is a private property. We set this to a new weak map. A weak map is essentially a dictionary where keys are objects and values can be anything. And the reason we call them weak maps is because the keys are weak. So if there are no references to these keys, there will be garbage collected. Now, inside of this constructor, we're not going to set the radius property anymore. Instead, we're going to work with this radius key map. We call the set method. The first argument is the key, and you can see that the key has to be an object. It cannot be a symbol. So here we pass this, which represents the instance of circle object. That's our key. And for the value, I'm going to use this radius argument. Now, technically, we can access this radius private property if we can get access to this weak map. But later, I'm going to talk about modules, and you will see that we can hide this radius in a module and only export the circle class. So imagine somewhere else in the code, we get the circle class. We won't have access to this weak map. And the circle object doesn't have a radius property, right? Let's inspect this on the console. So save. See, this is our circle object. Look, we don't have the radius property. Now, if you want to access this property inside of this class, we can do something like this. Let's imagine we want to read this somewhere. So I'm going to add our draw method. In order to read the radius property, we use our weak map, radius. Now, instead of calling the set method, we call the get method. We need to reference a key. In this case, the key is the instance of the circle object, this. And this will return the value of the radius property. So let's log that on the console. Now we can call c.draw and we get 1. Now how about defining a private method? We use another key map. So back here, I'm going to define another constant. Let's call this move and set it to a new weak map. Once again, in the constructor, we initialize this. So move.set, we pass this as the key and a function as the value. So here's a function. This is our move function, which is going to be a private function. Now here I'm going to do a console.log move. So we know we are in the move method. And also I want to add this so you will see what this means in this context. Now let's imagine in our draw method, which is a public method, we want to call the move method, which is a private method. Now, I know this is not a good example because when drawing something, we don't want to move it. But let's just imagine this is part of the implementation detail. So in order to access this move function, we use the same technique we used here. So I'm going to delete this. We use underline move key map, call the get method and pass this. Now this returns a function, so we can call that function, okay? And then we do a console.log of draw. Let's see what we get on the console. So save the changes. Now here we call c.draw. We got the message from the move method, but this is undefined because I told you that the body of this class is executed in strict mode, and this by default will be set to undefined as opposed to the global object. Now, in this particular implementation, maybe in the move method, we want to access the instance of the circle object. So how can we do this? Well, instead of using a regular function, we can use an arrow function, and the problem will go away because arrow functions use this value of their containing function. So in this case, this is not going to be rebound. It's going to be inherited from what we have in this constructor. So in this constructor, this references a circle object, And when we use an arrow function inside of this function, this will not be rebound. It's not going to be reset. It will be inherited from the constructor function. Okay, so let's save the changes. Call c.draw. Now we have the message from the move method, and here's our circle instance. So we can access all the public and private properties of the circle object in the move method. Now, one part you might be confused about is why we're using a separate weak map for each property or method. Why don't we create just one weak map for all the private members? Something like this. So constant private props, we set it to new weak map. And then here in the constructor, we could do something like this. Private props that set this. Now here we pass an object, and in this object we add all the private properties and methods. So we can add the radius property and set it to this radius argument. We could also add the move method. We use an arrow function here, and so on. Personally, I don't like this syntax. I think it's a little bit polluted. I prefer to work with each private member independently, but if you prefer this former syntax, by all means go for it. Just remember that if you use a single weak map, then in order to access, let's say, the radius property, you would do something like this. Private props that get this. Now this returns an object. That's this object here, right? Now this object has the radius property, and then you can access that here. Personally, I don't like this approach. So my preference is to use a separate weak map for each private member, like this.